Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Media Monitor, the show that analyses your news media both here at home and abroad. Now, we come to you on the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. I'm Peter Ndoro, and this is what you can look forward to on the programme. The detention of veteran South African journalist Angela Quintal and her Kenyan colleague Mutoki Mumo by Tanzanian authorities this past week has sent shockwaves across the media fraternity. Quintal and Mumo were arrested whilst on a reporting mission for the Committee to Protect Journalists. We take a closer look at why CNN reporter Jim Acosta had his White House press credentials suspended. President Donald Trump called Acosta a rude, terrible person following a tense exchange between the two at the televised news conference. All right, so those are our big stories that we'll be having discussions about. But before we get into that, let's take a look first at what's happening on the front pages of your Sunday newspapers. And we start with the Sunday Times this morning. Leads with a story about how State Security Minister ordered a re-vetting of all agents in a bid to flush out spooks accused of looting the slush fund of up to 1 billion rand. The drastic move for the re-vetting exercise at the State Security Agency is a purge targeting spooks deemed loyal to former Director General Arthur Fraser as well as former President Jacob Zuma. Well, the City Press is running with a story about former senior executives of the scandal-ridden VBS Mutual Bank, which has revealed that a branch manager was ordered to make a 3 million rand payment to fund a National Congress that was held by the South African Communist Party, the SACP, and that was last year, allegedly in an exchange for the party's silence on the bank's relationship with the controversial Gupta family. The Sunday Independent, that's carrying a story on how former Auditor General and lead investigator of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, Terence Nombembe, is being accused by high-ranking officials in the ANC and the EFF as being the culprit behind the leaked revised submission by Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan, detailing his meetings with the Guptas during former President Jacob Zuma's term. The Sunday Tribune is leading with a story of how pressure is mounting on Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan to come clean over his meetings with the Guptas. This intensified this week. The EFF are gunning for Gordhan to be axed from the cabinet after it appeared that he had contradicted himself in his statement to the State Capture Commission with his earlier responses. The Weekend Argus, that's running with a story about Cape Town Mayor Dan Plato, who is expected to unveil his mayoral committee today amid infighting and squabbles among factions within the caucus, which has delayed this election. Crossing the borders into Eswatini, the Sunday Observer there is carrying a story on how former Minister of Housing and Urban Development, Minister Mabuza, acted inappropriately by giving the councillors an ultimatum to renew Municipal Council of Mbabane Chief Executive Officer Gideon Mhlongo's contract. And moving to West Africa, the front page of Nigeria's Daily Trust there is leading with a story about the national chairman of the All Progressive Congress, the APC party, Comrade Adams Oshiomhole, returned to the country yesterday and opened up on his encounter with officers of the Department of State Services as a conversation, not an arrest or detention. All right, so that's what's happening on the front pages of your Sunday newspapers today. And a little bit later on, I hope we'll be able to get into some of those stories. But we begin with the news that rocked South Africa's news fraternity this past week when South African journalist Angela Quintal and her Kenyan colleague from the Committee to Protect Journalists, the CPJ, Mutoki Mumo, were detained by Tanzanian authorities. The two were arrested at their hotel room in Dar es Salaam on Wednesday evening and then taken to an unknown location by immigration and security officials for allegedly violating the conditions of their visas. Well, news of their brief detention caused an international outcry, raising concerns about the intimidation of journalists and its impact on media freedom in Tanzania. The CPJ has called on the country's government to halt its crackdown on the media. Quintal and Mumo have since left the country. Now, according to the 2018 World Press Index, Tanzania is now ranked at number 93 of 180 countries, and this has seen the country drop 10 positions in what is seen as a worsening situation for journalists in the country. Media Monitor did try to reach out to the CPJ executives to speak on the matter, but we weren't able to find a representative to join us. Well, to help us unpack this story and explore it a little bit more, I'm now joined in studio by Diane Hawker, Head of News at Power FM. Always a pleasure to have you. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great.
Good
and
morning.
we also have Tebogo Ditsejo, who's a media analyst from Ditsejo Media. Thanks very much for joining us. Welcome as well to you.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So, as a journalist, and Diane, you would relate to this as well because you're right in the heart of it still. That people can be arrested for being journalists in 2018 is sad. Your initial reaction when you heard about this detention in Tanzania?
Well, the first thing that I'd actually seen was Angela Quintal's a Facebook post, because she posted an SOS. And very short post saying SOS, we've been detained, and then obviously people in the South African journalistic community started talking amongst each other, trying to find out what had actually happened, and then it seems like also her Facebook was used without her consent, so either hacked or somebody was using one of her devices, because another journalist had posted that a message that was put up on there saying we are all fine and all is well was not written by her. So it's quite concerning. I think here in South Africa, to a certain extent, we have a privilege of not necessarily having those kind of fears. But the work that the CPJ does focus on, protecting journalists all around the world. And it kind of puts it in sharp focus that we are in a privileged position here because we don't have those kind of concerns. But elsewhere, journalists are targeted on a regular basis. They are detained, they are arrested, they are stopped from doing their work. And in some instances, just across the border here in Swaziland, you have, people having difficulty reporting accurately and fairly because of the pressure from government. So, I think it is something that we as a South African journalistic community, we don't experience often, but we should have sort of solidarity for others who are going through that elsewhere in the world. All
right, Tebogo, again, it must be a concern. I've got to say, the President, John Magufuli, is nicknamed the bulldozer. He's really has not tolerated any criticism of himself or his policies since becoming president in 2015. And that World Press Index sort of dropped from 83 to 93 shows that he really is cracking down. African presidents should know by now that this is not the way to manage the media.
I think that characterization is very important. And the focus on African leadership is also very important. I think that generally in Africa, we don't have shared principles when it comes to media freedom. And I think perhaps it's because the consequences of disrupting media freedom are not as high, as the benefits of disrupting media freedom. And I'll tell you that if it was the case that you could get sanctioned, for insulting, media freedom and not holding on to the principles of protecting media freedom, perhaps we would see different behaviors. But we look at a lot of countries where it seems as if consolidating power is the most important thing over serving the people. And until we have those shared principles, we will not move forward. Now, I want to give you a very interesting business perspective. We have an office in Rwanda, and there's a reason why we have an office in Rwanda, because it is very conducive to conduct business in Rwanda. But unfortunately, there are other countries which we would love to enter into, Tanzania being one of them, that we would perhaps not necessarily currently, because you had that incident of the billionaire who was kidnapped. You have this incident of 2 South African journalists who have been detained. and perhaps it was not even, for good cause. So I think that it also disrupts our economic development. But if you're not worried about how it's affecting the people on the ground, then you will continue to do it.
All right. So, Diane, people at home are probably thinking, come on, you journalists think you're special. Why is it important that journalists should be allowed to do what they do and not get intimidated by the authorities and arrested and detained?
Well, I mean, journalists don't sort of write their stories or do news stories for themselves. They're serving a greater public good. And it's important that they're able to play oversight roles and be able to kind of monitor what's happening within government, what's happening in civil society, what's happening in business. And when those spaces are closed off, it means that citizens are not actually aware of what's happening. And to the point that you're making, there is a focus sort of on African leadership. But I think what we're entering now, what we're seeing with even in the US with President Donald Trump, is that there is an attack on the media because once sort of the truth is out there, or once information is out there, it allows people to think differently about what is being said by political leaders. And if those political leaders don't want citizens to think differently, what they start to do is to close off and to attack the press, so that the only narrative is the narrative that's coming directly from their offices. And that can be quite dangerous.
Sometimes authorities say that writing negatively about one's country is being unpatriotic. How do we deal with it?
Well, I think that is totally a misdirection of facts. It is patriotic, to expose corruption. It is patriotic to inform the public, because in whose interest is patriotism? It is to the interest of the public, of the people who make up the country. And so I think that it's important for us to also understand that there can be no leadership without people giving them the mandate. Now you look at Tanzania, which is one of the proud African countries. I mean, if you look at tribalism, they've dealt with it through Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. His policies ensured that even though they've got over 110 tribes in Tanzania, they still have shared values, and tribalism is nowhere to be found. Now, if in terms of media freedom, that index that you mentioned started in 2002. And at that time, Tanzania was 62 out of the more than 170 countries. Now they've gone down more than 31, in that ranking. That cannot be good for tourism, for business. There's nothing good about that. So the question is, how do we hold African leaders to account? And I think that the answer would lie with the African Union. What is the African Union doing to intervene? Whether maybe it might not be sanctions, but how do you hold them to account to say that this is wrong? And these are the consequences for your country. We may condemn you, and in future we could consider something different.
All right. So it seems that the Department of International Relations, DIRCO, moved quite quickly here, and this is possibly why the detention wasn't so long in the end. But not all journalists have their government backing them. There are journalists inside Tanzania who are still missing to this day. And I just wonder, you mentioned the African Union. Is there another way for us to put pressure on African states, African governments, to make sure that the media is allowed to do their job?
Well, I think in the absence of the African Union, we do see some civil society organizations applying some of that pressure. So Amnesty International has been one of the organizations that has been quite vocal on issues of, the disappearance of journalists or the intimidation of journalists. And I also know that recently there was a dinner that was held in Johannesburg in which Angela Quintal actually attended it and had requested that Amnesty International sort of give additional support to the CPJ in areas where they are not able to kind of get that voice out. So I think where civil society groups are able to kind of join forces, and you use a large organization like Amnesty or others to kind of put additional pressure, that can also be beneficial because their footprint is bigger. But I do think that beyond that, there does need to be a conversation maybe around the journalistic community and also within the African Union opinion about what barometer or what kind of rules we will have, because they change and they're fluid country to country. You don't know if you're going to visit the country and report on it, what you'll deal with in any given instance.
Right, let's bring it home. Is South Africa under threat in any way? I mean, we've got this secrecy bill that's being debated for quite a while now. Is that a threat to media freedom? A question for both of you. Teboho?
Well, I'm not necessarily sure if the secrecy bill would be a threat, but we can discuss media freedom generally in South Africa. And if we look at the same index, because that's the only barometer that we have, it may be scientifically flawed, but I think it is a good guideline. Now, if you look at the same index in 2002, South Africa was ranked 26th. The United States was ranked 17th at that time. And the United States is currently 45th. And South Africa is 28th. So we're doing very well when it comes to media freedom. There's no doubt about that. We're currently not at our highest, which was in 2003 when we were ranked 21st. But we're doing very well. I think what we can do is look at the mechanics of media and the agenda that is being set. I don't necessarily believe, that we have reached a point where we can say that we're sophisticated enough to be setting an agenda that is plural and that is dealing with various contexts and various realities. I think we have a more centered approach around perhaps government corruption, which is very important, but we need to go beyond that. Is it possible for us to have perhaps sessions, where the president has press conferences and he answers the questions directly and not necessarily, transfer the responsibility to a minister? I think we should look at that.
Okay. I mean, I mentioned the secrecy bill because they're saying that, you could be jailed for up to 25 years for passing on classified information. So this week we've seen this leak of Pravin Gordhan's testimony, his representations at State Capture Commission. We'll talk a little bit about who may or may not have been behind this. But the judge had to say, this is illegal, do not do it.
Yeah.
If there's no sanction, what's to stop journalists from misbehaving?
Well, I think when you read Judge Zondo's statement, it's kind of a warning, because the previous leaks that happened revolving around Nhlanhla testimony and other aspects were not actually addressed. And I think this one probably was addressed because it was much wider and much more publicized. And what he's really saying is, stop, or you will be in trouble. Those of us who've reported on court proceedings before know that, sometimes there is that element of pushing the line, and a judge will intervene. Like if you get access to a statement that hasn't yet been entered in court and it's published, the judges have been known to warn journalists and not then, and generally then, people step back and they say, okay, we're not going to continue with this. So I think that there won't be any sanction. If there would have been, that probably would have been in that statement so far. But definitely important for us to note the rules of the Commission of Inquiry, the rules not only for journalists but for all other people, because the thing about that affidavit is that it was circulating beyond just the journalistic community. People had read it on Twitter, people were reading it on WhatsApp, so it really was spread far and wide. And then from the journalistic perspective, the horse is then bolted. Do you then not report on it? So it's such a tricky space to be in.
Yeah. Okay, all right. We'll leave it there for the time being. When we come back, we'll take a look at the fallout between US President Donald Trump and a CNN journalist.
SABC is independent and impartial, and it's important that as we deliver the news, we do so without fear, without favour, without prejudice, and that we ensure that we get the multiplicity of views so that our stories and coverage is balanced.
We pride ourselves on being impartial as well as independent. On the agenda, we basically break down the stories of the day, give it more substance and give it more detail. So all in all, we basically take the news agenda of the day forward.
But more than that, we'll be able to reflect the stories of ordinary folk, people who are trying to make ends meet, facing the most incredibly difficult obstacles and circumstances, and that they will find that their realities are expressed on the SABC.
To be a part of something like this makes me proud, and I think that to be able to report the news in a fair, just, independent and impartial way is what the public broadcaster stands for.
We pride ourselves on being impartial as well as independent. On the agenda, we basically break down the stories of the day.
Give the viewer the assurance that we will cover every side of the story.
Tear gas has now been also thrown at the protesters.
We are peacefully marching and the police is stopping the people, they're hitting the people, we are spraying the people with pepper spray. These people are supposed to protect us, but they are against us.
We are pushing them back by using the rubber bullets because we cannot allow them to block the roads and damage other people's property.
Quite important to bring on board all sides and hear what everybody has to say about the story, especially being the public broadcaster.
All in all, we basically take the news agenda of the day forward.
Welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. Now, the CNN's chief White House correspondent, journalist Jim Acosta, who was described by President Donald Trump as a rude, terrible person at a press conference about the midterm elections, has had his press pass to the White House withdrawn this past week. Angered by the questions Acosta asked him regarding his views on immigrants, President Trump told the CNN reporter to sit down. When he refused, an intern attempted to take the microphone from Acosta's hand, but he resisted. Trump's press secretary Sarah Sanders took to social media the following day, saying that the White House had withdrawn Acosta's press pass because he had placed his hand on a female White House intern. Sanders later posted a video which a media analyst says, well, it probably was altered. Let's take a look.
Question, are you worried?
That's enough. That's
Mr.
enough.
President,
that's enough.
Ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am.
Excuse President, me. That's enough.
Mr. President, I have one of the statements that you made in the tail end of the campaign in the midterms. That
here we go.
If you don't mind, Mr. President, that this caravan was an invasion. As you know, Mr. President,
I consider it to be an invasion.
As you know, Mr. President, the caravan was not an invasion. It's a group of migrants moving up from Central America towards the border with the U.S.
Thank you for telling me that. I appreciate it.
Why did you characterize it as such?
Because I consider it an invasion. You and I have a difference of opinion.
But do you think that you demonized immigrants in this election
to
try to keep them?
I want them to come into the country, but they have to come in legally. You know, they have to come in, Jim, through a process. I want it to be a process, and I want people to come in, and we need the people.
Your campaign.
Wait. You know why we need the people, don't you? Because we have hundreds of companies moving in. We need the people.
But your campaign had an ad showing migrants climbing over walls and so on.
That's true. But they weren't actors.
They're not going to be doing that.
They weren't actors. Well, no, it's true. Do you think they were actors? They weren't actors. They didn't come from Hollywood. Right. These were people. This was an actual, it happened a few days ago. And
they're hundreds of miles away, though. They're hundreds and hundreds of miles away. That's not an invasion.
Honestly, I think you should let me run the country. You run CNN.
All right.
And if you did it well, your ratings would be much better.
If I may ask one other question, Mr. President, if I may ask one other question, are you worried?
That's enough. That's enough.
Mr. President,
that's
enough. I was going to ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am. Mr.
Excuse
President,
me. That's enough.
Mr. President, I had one other question, if I may ask, on the Russia investigation. Are you concerned that you may have?
I'm not concerned about anything with the Russian
investigation
because it's a hoax. That's enough. Put down the mic.
Mr. President, are you worried about indictments coming down in this investigation?
Mr. President.
I'll tell you what, CNN should be ashamed of itself having you working for them. You are a rude, terrible person. You shouldn't be working for CNN. Go ahead.
I think that's unfair.
You're a very rude person. The way you treat Sarah Huckabee is horrible. And the way you treat other people are horrible. You shouldn't treat people that way. Go ahead. Go ahead, Peter. Go ahead.
In Jim's defense, I've traveled with him and watched him. He's a diligent reporter who busts his
butt. Well, I'm not
like
a big
the rest
fan
of
of yours either. So
I understand.
To be honest.
So let me ask you a question, if I can.
All right. Sometimes when we watch this, we don't know whether this is real life or actually a TV program that he's in. And so that's what happened. That was the exchange. This is the drama that played out. And I think you saw a little bit of a clip there of the the situation that happened between him and the intern. But anyway, the Sanders, the press secretary of the White House, then started tweeting after that, and these are some of the things that she said on Twitter. Says Trump believes that free press and expects and welcomes tough questions of him and his administration. We will, however, never... Okay, all right, we're going to come back to those tweets. But essentially what she was saying is that, look, we don't shy away from tough questions. The president does want to have questions put to him. But they felt that, here we go again. However, they said they will not tolerate a reporter placing his hands on a young woman just trying to do her job as a White House intern. Okay, so that was the tweet that came out. And what I'd like us to do actually now is go back to those clips, because the key to this whole story is where she says, will not tolerate putting his hand on a White House intern. Let's take a look at the clip once again, and this is how it happened in real time, and let's see if we can make up our minds about what to think.
May I ask one other question? Are you worried?
That's enough. That's enough.
Mr. President,
that's enough.
Ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am.
Excuse President, me. That's enough.
Mr. President,
all right, so that's in real time. This is before the other clip that we're going to see. What's your impression? Is that putting your hand on an intern? I mean, by saying that, it's true. Yes, he put his hand there, but the suggestion is that it was almost violent. Yeah. I don't know, your thoughts?
The suggestion from the tweet is that he almost would have pushed her, but really he was holding his hand up and she was trying to get the microphone. So I'm not sure if I believe the putting his hands on this White House intern. It didn't seem like he was trying to be violent towards her in any way. He was holding onto the microphone.
And he even said, "Pardon me, ma'am."
Yes, yes, he does.
Well, I'm in two minds about this. One is substantive issues, and the other is procedural. I think we should start with the lighter notes, the procedural. Donald Trump at that time answered 68 questions from 35 journalists. So it's barely 2 questions per journalist. So procedurally, you can say that Jim Acosta was a bit, he was over the top, you know, in trying to ask 4 questions. But if we talk about the substantial issue of demonizing immigrants and demonizing the caravan that is coming from Mexico into the United States and calling them invaders, that is very dangerous. You know, to call people who are coming into your country.
You know what I'm going to do? We'll talk about the substantive issue, but just look again, and let's play that clip again, this time in what appears to be a doctored version, and this is what it looks like. So remember before it was quite quick, but now this time it appears as if what they've done is they've speeded up the chop, so it looks as if it's much more violent. Whereas earlier, I don't know if we can play the clip from before again, the original one, and just see the difference. The original one, not this one. Okay, now watch it this time. It was much softer and much quicker. So, you know, an analyst has suggested that this was doctored purposefully. Now, if this is true, we've gone to another whole level. You know, before it's one thing to say, you know, there was a full crowd at my inauguration, even though you could see there wasn't. But there's another thing when you actually sit down in an edit suite and change the speed of a tape to make it look in a certain way. I mean, this is a whole new
Well, this speaks to this whole thing that I was saying earlier about certain leaders wanting the narrative that comes out and that people engage with to be only their narrative. And we see that with President Donald Trump all the time, where if anybody comes with an alternative view, he starts calling it alternative facts, he starts referring to it as fake news. I mean, he's had a very, very antagonistic relationship with CNN, and there's specific reporters that he has, you know, not really come to blows with, but has had very tense altercations with. And just to your point about Jim Acosta's 4 questions, you know, we ask follow-up questions. That's what journalists do, because Donald Trump was not actually answering the question. So you can't really expect Jim Acosta to have then sat down if the question was not answered. It's his job to continue to ask questions. Yes, the White House might not be happy about it, but would he have been doing his job as a journalist if he did not follow up? And where is his responsibility? His responsibility is not necessarily to the White House. It's to the people that he wants to inform about the activities of the White House. And would he have fulfilled that responsibility if he sat down after question 1? I don't think so.
So now he'd been White House correspondent for 5 years. So this is somebody that they knew, and somebody that had been working with them. And in fact, again, Sanders says the conduct is absolutely unacceptable. It's also completely disrespectful to the reporters' colleagues not to allow them an opportunity to ask a question. President Trump has given the press more access than any president in history. And I think it does speak to partly what you said, that he was asking more questions than the others. But I just wonder, with this response, is it a question of, listen, I don't like this guy, I don't want him, and then they had to find a reason? And playing back this tape, it wasn't quite enough, and they perhaps thought, listen, we've got to make it look better. Do you think that they found a reason, that they wanted him gone already? Well,
I think that if I do disagree that Jim Acosta had a right to ask 4 questions. I disagree with that. If you have to be reasonable to other people who only asked 1 or 2 questions. But in terms of the consequences for that, it should be that we move on to the next question. It's not that you now get your accreditation taken away. And it's also not that we now find a reason, because obviously President Trump does not like the CNN. He's got an adversarial relationship with them. And therefore, they obviously looked for a reason, because the person was moving away from having the mic taken away from him. And then they found a reason to get rid of him.
In his defense, the president wasn't answering the questions. So what do? You just sit down.
Well, unfortunately, that's the procedure. If you're only given 2 questions and you ask 2 questions. But I don't think that necessarily means that you should be taking... It doesn't mean your accreditation should be taken. It just means we must move on to the next question.
But you see, that's the problem with the Trump administration then. Because if the rules are that you only get to ask 2 questions and then he refuses to answer those 2 questions, what do you get at the end of that? You get a question unanswered. You do not get information. The Trump administration is confusing providing access with actually providing relevant information. I can sit with you and have a conversation and say nothing. You've had access, but have I given you anything? And that's, I think, where they are kind of playing fast and loose with the truth.
And is it presidential to say to a journalist, you are a rude, terrible person?
Well, there are worse things that he said in that conference. He said that one journalist is racist for asking him whether he's a white nationalist. He then went to another African-American journalist and said, that's a stupid question. That's not even, it's inhumane, it's not even unpresidential, it's beyond that.
Right. And I think she was also a CNN journalist, the African-American journalist.
So was this violence against this intern? Let's get a judgment on that.
Not at all.
I don't think it was violence against the intern. I actually think that more aggressive than Jim Acosta to the intern was Donald Trump's response subsequently once the mic was taken, when he then continued to berate Jim Acosta and, as you mentioned, other journalists. Because also you have to understand, he's in the position as the president, and here he is berating journalists on national television, on international television. What message is that then sending to those that are watching it? The subtle message is, don't listen to these people, because I've said that they're rude, they're disrespectful, I've said this one lady is stupid, and that, I think, is abuse of his power.
Well, I also want to enter this fray, because if you look at the United States generally, its reputation has fallen. It's not just reputation in the so-called S-hole countries. It's also in the European Union. A lot of Europeans don't want to travel to the United States merely because of Donald Trump's foreign policy. And I think also, if you look at tourism, tourist arrivals has dropped by 2%, while globally it's increased by 4%.
All right. So if it was not violence and they've taken his pass away from him because they said it was violence, what should happen now? What can they do? Because surely the White House can't really get away with this.
Well, in theory, you would think that CNN would be able to challenge this in some way. But with this current White House, I don't think that they would get very far with that. So what they would probably then have to do is see if they can get someone else to continue to report on the White House. I don't think that by removing one journalist that Trump is necessarily going to sort of get more favorable reporting from CNN or any of the other media houses that he's had an adversarial relationship with. In fact, it could possibly be the opposite, where there's even more intensity and more sort of focus on his presidency, partly also because of some of the things that have been happening with the various investigations that are underway, the various people that have left his administration. There's no way that it's going to result in less attention.
All right, Tebogo, I mean, we started this conversation with Tanzania and authorities there, heavy hand. And I just wonder, no pun intended with a heavy hand, is this not the same kind of behavior where actually they're intimidating the press by saying, we will withdraw your passes if we don't like you?
Yes. So it's exactly this. For me, it's very similar issues that are happening here. And I think that on the side of US President Donald Trump, it is because he is a populist. And he has driven this global populist movement where it's not necessarily about the substance of what you're saying, but how loud you say it and how many times you repeat it. And if anybody contradicts it, then you attack them. So that's the modus operandi of this global populism, of which I think is very dangerous for our discourse.
All right, okay, we'll leave it there for the time being. Donald Trump, I have no doubt that during the course of this next week, he will give us something else to talk about. But we take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll take a look at some of our newspapers.
Need to know more about the markets? This is where it all starts. At the SABC's headquarters in Auckland Park in Johannesburg, South Africa. We analyze, report, crunch the numbers, call in the experts, package the news, and bring you critical global market updates from the JSE.
The continent's leaders in liquid market movement and the fastest growing secondary listings made right here.
Small businesses, the backbone of the economy. With South Africa's very high unemployment rate, it's said that 90% of new jobs could come from this sector.
Every weekday afternoon on DSTV, channel 404.
Right, welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. It's time now for us to take a look at some of the stories that were in the newspapers. So we went through the front pages a little bit earlier on, but let's go back to my guests and see what grabbed their attention. Let me start with you, Diane. What did you pick up in the papers that you want to talk about?
Well, there's a lot of stories that kind of have intrigue and scandal and spies and all of that. But for me, the one that I think is going to really hit home with a lot of people is one that's the second story on the Sunday Independent front page about medical aid increases going up by 10%, and I think it mentions that one of them could go up as much 10.7%. And if you look at the current financial situation that people are dealing with, VAT has gone up, the price of food has gone up, petrol has gone up numerous times this year. And then to deal with also a medical aid increase, when oftentimes your medical aid doesn't last you throughout the year, a lot of people are going to be feeling a lot of pain as a result of this. And I mean, it feeds into that whole broader conversation that I think we have, in a way, put on the back burner as a nation about, are we happy with our healthcare system as it stands? To be paying so much for medical aid and you're not sure how far it's going to get you, and then a 10% increase. I mean, if you're paying about 1,000 Rand a month, that's minimum. That means you're paying 12,000 Rand a year, and then you add 10% on top of that. That's a lot of money.
And the reality, though, sadly, is that this conversation actually is really looking at a small percentage of the population. By and large, the majority of South Africans, they're going to pick up this newspaper and they have no interaction with medical aid schemes because they, A, can't afford it, a lot of them are unemployed. And I suppose this is why the NHI has to happen and has to happen quite quickly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it has a significant economic impact when citizens are not healthy. It affects the life expectancy, and I think it also speaks to how important it is for us to improve public healthcare systems, because then, the public will then get access to, good quality healthcare.
All right, so what about you? What intrigued you?
Well, firstly, the story about Africa must look to Africa for financing is very important. I mean, it's a discussion that's been happening for many years. I mean, in the 1980s, you had the first president of Burkina Faso talking about the importance of us looking from within for our solutions. And if we go outside and look for solutions elsewhere, the conditions that come with those loans sometimes can have an impact on our well-being, our future sustainability, and our sovereignty. And I also think a second story, which is very important, is going to start from tomorrow, the 12th of November to the 16th, which is Global Entrepreneurship Week. From a South African perspective, I think we need to look at how can we facilitate the growth of small and medium-sized businesses, because they create 60% of the total workforce. How can we get it up like with other countries where over 80% of the workforce is small and medium-sized businesses?
Okay, you've raised two important issues. Let's start with financing, though. Do we have the money on the continent to finance each other, and how do we do it?
Well, sorry, if I could just get in there. I mean, we had the Africa Investment Forum held in the Sandton Convention Centre this week. And I think that would suggest that we do actually have the money on the continent.
So where is it going right now?
Well, if I could just finish there. So you have some of these big players, like you have Aliko Dangote, who has come, I mean, Africa's richest man. And he's in construction. You've also got the African Development Bank, and sort of via South Africa potentially also got the BRICS Development Bank. So I think that it's the money is not necessarily the question. It's the how we are thinking of investment. Are we overly reliant on foreign aid as a method of investment, or should we be looking to say, okay, actually Nigeria's got this money, South Africa's got the resources and the skills and ability. Why can't we join forces instead of being, antagonistic to one another, and actually build something that would benefit the broader region?
All right. Your thoughts? I mean, is the money here? Where is it going at the moment that we are having this conversation about trying to finance ourselves?
Well, that was a very, very important point. I think we need to look at our strengths as African countries. South Africa's strength is infrastructure. How can we help other African countries build their infrastructure? Because that is what is going to impact on intra-Africa trade. And for us to increase our revenue, we need to trade with each other. It's more likely, in other countries, if you look at any country in the world, Germany, their largest trading partners are their neighboring country, but not in Africa. In South Africa, our top 5 largest trading countries are none of these African countries. So we need to look at ways in which to build that infrastructure, improve, energy security, and to come together, bring our wealth together, and share it amongst each other so that we can start to, impact and increase intra-Africa trade.
All right. Other stories. Minister purges slush fund spies, and this is the front page of the Sunday Times. And I guess in an institution such as that, you've got to have people that you trust. But I just wonder whether we're not in a situation where anybody that seemed to have been, whether they were actually guilty of anything, might find themselves on the wrong side of these kinds of purges.
Well, I think it's an important story because I think generally we really need to look at how our security agencies are run. If you look at something like the State Security Agency, there's not much oversight that happens there. In Parliament, the Intelligence Committee does perform an oversight role, but none of that is public. You've got the Inspector General of Intelligence, who has complained numerous times that there isn't enough funding, there aren't enough resources for that office to operate properly. And we also know that our security agencies have been used before for political battles. You look at crime intelligence. There's also an issue of a slush fund there. Nobody knows where that money has gone to this day, even though Parliament did hear some testimony about that. So for me, the story isn't necessarily only about this purge aspect, but the running of our security agencies and how, whether we're happy about it as a nation. Because personally, I think that there's a lot that has gone on in the security agencies linked to state capture that we have yet to hear more about, and that we will find ourselves very unhappy with.
City Press is in front of you, the front page there, VBS paid SACP. So, you know, more and more this VBS tentacles seem to be spreading out. If it's true, that's the last people that I'm sure people expected South African Communist Party to be receiving cash to keep quiet about the Guptas. Your thoughts?
Well, that's very interesting. And if that was the strategy, it clearly didn't work, you know, because they were one of the vocal people, including even the EFF were very vocal, you know, about the Gupta family. So I think it was very bad investment if they saw that as an investment. But I think, tragically speaking, we don't have a black-owned bank in South Africa that is necessarily going to start to compete with those big four, you know, and so when are we going to start to develop that? I think another thing is, beyond this story, how do we characterize corruption when it is done in the private sector by a black person? Do we then paint black business with the same brush? I think that is one of the things that we've seen, you know, currently happening. And it is not only by white people, even black people do that. You know, so I think we need to look at this, take it in isolation, use it as a case study, and we must make sure we put measures in place that this never happens again.
All right, so yeah, VBS, it does talk about corruption, but it's brought in a few people that we never thought would be involved.
Yeah.
Do you think there will be more casualties as this story continues to unfold?
I think the VBS story is still at its beginning. It's not anywhere near the end. We saw in Parliament this week there was a testimony from those investigating VBS, and I thought it was very telling what the Hawks said, that this started off as them looking at fraud, but they are now looking at what they are seeing as a much bigger investigation that involves allegations of racketeering, money laundering, and various other crimes. But you know, to the point being made here is that you know, because this happened with the executive of this bank, I really do think that there is a question to be asked about whether the bank itself as an institution should be thrown out because those who are running the bank committed various crimes. You know what I mean? If you look at an institution like the SABC, where there have been instances where there have been questions about those in leadership, you don't get rid of the SABC. And while the VBS might not be on that level, it's certainly for the communities of Limpopo and those who started it, it was an institution. It was the one place that they could go to for decades to get home loans and things like that, where you couldn't get that from the sort of formal banking sector. And then for those people, should that be let go of?
So it should be worth saving, is that what you're suggesting? All right, it's going to be another week. What do you think we should be looking out for in the week ahead? What's likely to be on our pages and in the media?
State capture?
I think, perhaps, Actually, we'll let you...
It's very excited about that.
The State Capture Commission of Inquiry, it's meant to go back this week. I think a lot of people are interested in Pravin Gordhan's testimony, which will be towards the end of the week. But I personally am quite interested to hear from Barbara Hogan about her time as the Minister of Public Enterprises. So I think there'll be a big focus on SOEs, but also just some personal anecdotes, I'm hoping, about what actually happened during her time. Was she pushed out? Was she intimidated? Did she have the difficulties that others who've testified in the inquiry have spoken about?
Do you think that the former president, might be pulled in even more into this inquiry through these testimonies?
It's possible, because these are people that he would have interacted with a lot more closely than, you know, the likes of Pumla Williams or Feki Mento, who wasn't part of government, the executive at the time. So these would be discussions that would have related directly to his involvements with his ministers. So I think it is possible.
All right. And do you think a certain minister might be fired this week?
No, it's not going to happen this week. But I think the next 7 months, a certain minister may not be a minister anymore. And I think we might even see a restructuring of government per se, because we are facing serious challenges, and including the VAT increase, which has impacted us severely. And maybe over time, once we have seen those savings happen, we need to look at how do we restructure this petrol price, because it's not acceptable that we can spend over 5 Rand 60 on taxes for every litre of petrol that we buy. So I think we need to restructure that.
And I think e-tolls might be another story that's going to surface quite a bit. Tebogo, Diane, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank
and your insights are always greatly appreciated by Media Monitor. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to you at home, thanks very much indeed for tuning in. That's how we wrap up Media Monitor for this week. Join us again next week at the same time for more of the same. From me and the team, have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.